and welcome to our YouTube channel. Today we have a very special guest, Andrew Tanner Smith, who is an expert in supply chains and procurement. So welcome, Andrew. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So first, could you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you get into procurement?
Well, I like a lot of people, fell into it a bit. I was approached by a headhunter company who had done. I'd used to be in market research, researching mobile and telecoms companies, and a headhunter wanted to know if I was interested in supplying research services to Nokia's internal indirect procurement organization. And so I did. And this was back in 2005. In 2007, Nokia divested its networks business off with Siemens to create a joint venture. And I went with that organization. And they didn't have the overhead for research services to procurement. They needed people that could actually do the stuff. So over the course of the next 15 years, I learned everything about procurement from the ground up, because starting from the merger of two companies back in 2007, we had to basically make everything ourselves from scratch. So we cobbled bits of processes and tools from various parent companies, but largely it was an open, like Wild West. We need to build a process. We need to do SOX compliance. We need to have a due diligence process. So I was thrown into that melee with the brief to making our processes, our purchasing processes, SOX compliant, supplier requirements, all built into the process. So due diligence and all the rest of it. So that's how I learned my trade.
So how many years did you say you've been in procurement for? Over 10 years?
Oh yes, 17 years. Yeah.
That's amazing. And obviously, we've had a couple of crucial years here, especially last year, and it has changed the way people see procurement. And I guess a lot of people who didn't necessarily think about procurement or know what it is, it's very much at the forefront of discussion these days. What do you think are some of the challenges that companies are facing in sourcing new suppliers in this kind of new environment where last year we saw that many companies struggled with sourcing, whether that be they had problems with their existing supplier or they wanted to branch out but they weren't sure how, and their supply chain was unstable. So what do you think are some of these challenges that people are facing?
There are lots of them. If you go back to the sourcing suppliers, can be a minefield. It's easy enough to get a list of suppliers that have a particular component, or whether it's indirect or direct goods, that particular material that you need for your business. But understanding how that supplier performs, how that supplier is going to perform for you in future, who else is competing for that, those components, and what's the capacity of that supplier to supply you longer term. That's a really important piece of work you need to do at the beginning, and it's really difficult for the smaller and medium-sized enterprises that maybe don't have, or have a very small dedicated procurement function to do that, because and this, I think, goes into one of your other questions about how sourcing has evolved over the last 20, 30 years. Used to be someone in accounts, placed orders, all well and good, and there's a lot of time with accounts, but it's a different thing completely. Having the ability to find those suppliers, work out whether those suppliers are viable for you in the longer term. Can you bet your business on them? That's a completely different skill set to, the accounting function. So it's evolved from the accounting function to its own thing. But for smaller companies that don't have the overhead, the time needed to find the right suppliers, build those relationships, and to the point where you can bet your company on them, which is essentially what you're doing with your suppliers. Then you're going to struggle if you don't have that function within your enterprise, and we've seen that in the COVID era, that having a good procurement function is essential.
And do you think the way people are sourcing suppliers has changed post-COVID? And what do you think are the main key factors of having, good procurement?
Yeah, there are a number of things going on. I think the COVID pandemic has shown how reliant companies are on their suppliers. Companies knew that anyway, but it's brought it out to the open. To the public. You saw empty shelves at the beginning of the pandemic, and you saw loo paper not on shelves, and silly things like that. That was a one-off event. Things changed very quickly, and I think overall procurement as an industry has stepped up to the challenge. But for perhaps the first time, on a wide scale, people have begun to realise what the supply chain involves. It's not just Tesco's or Waitrose or whoever. At the end of it, there's a whole. And I don't like referring to the word supply chain. Actually, it's a supply network for me. It's a bit more complex than the chain. It's not such a hierarchical thing, but there's a whole supply network around supplying the loo paper on the shelves, and everyone has their role to play, and so it's becoming more focused on suppliers being able to fulfill what they need to on time, at the right quantities, and doing that consistently, and for companies to or sourcing managers to know that they're rely on those suppliers to be able to do that consistently. So yes, consistency, longevity, and that really means that the relationships are becoming much more entwined and more collaborative. And my focus as a procurement person is to look at the relationship between suppliers and buyers, and understand how they can fulfill new markets or new product markets, new geographic markets, however they want to tackle that new market opportunity, how they do that with suppliers, how they collaborate to produce new goods and services, and what it takes to be a good collaboration partner, whether it's their company's fit or not. And all of this is a central question. It's about it's can you bet your company on this supplier, and not every supplier is the same. You don't necessarily need to bet your company on the office stationery supplier, but if you're selling parts, sub-assemblies for trains or whatever, then you need to have suppliers that can supply you those specific parts that you need on time to fulfill your customers. So you are betting your company on those suppliers, and that relationship, in those circumstances, it's always been needed to be strong, but now I think it's evolving even more. So suppliers and companies need to collaborate to drive their markets forward.
You mentioned the importance of collaboration and choosing very carefully which supplier you're going to use. Obviously, it is very important. So what advice would you give when somebody is looking for a supplier? how would they choose one that would be a good collaboration for them?
Okay, this is a very multi faceted answer, let's put it that way. But there are a number of different things you need to think about. In terms of if we take two organizations, two enterprises coming together, do they have the same goals? And are they after the same thing? Do they have different values and different cultural fits? Is one part of the market going to be more interesting for one partner than the other? There needs to be some synergy, some fit with the company to ensure that these companies that they're both singing from the same hymn sheet, that they both share the same goals. That's on the bigger level. And on the when you get into the company and the people level, you've got to have people on both sides that are that understand how to talk to each other and not necessarily negotiate and butt heads over terms and conditions and prices, which is all fine, and that's what procurement does. But how they need the skills to be able to see where the companies can go with this, with their relationship, and what opportunities there are in the marketplace. So there needs to be some understanding at that functional level, and with each individual employee and their stakeholders. And that implies that the stakeholders and their procurement people are aligned, because that has to happen anyway. And then it needs alignment from the collaborator as well. So then there's it works on different layers, and there needs to, all of these layers, whether it's organizational, functional, or down to the person, they need to have the right skills, attributes, and they need to want the same outcomes. So there's a lot of alignment that needs to happen.
Right. Do you see the benefit then, based on that, on digital platforms, especially going forward, as a way to access suppliers that perhaps would not be accessible by other means, that they can tap into and find new suppliers based on certain requirements that they would be best suited to collaborate with?
Yeah, I mean, I think digitization and digital transformation of procurement is a no-brainer. It's opened up such an opportunity for companies to join networks, whether they're proprietary or whether they're sort of open, on these digital platforms, to start looking at new suppliers. And with the digital world, it's becoming a little bit more easier, at least to start that initial scouting phase. So where you've you don't really know who's in the market, or who can challenge your supplier, who's got a bit lazy and a bit tardy with their performance. Maybe you want to challenge them and bring in the second supplier. Where do you get that from? In very specialized markets, you can join networks digitally now to find sources in your companies. The hard work, of course, comes later in making sure that supplier can deliver to you, that they meet your requirements and all the rest of it. But the digitalization of the processes, finding those suppliers, bringing them on board, and everything that goes right through the S2P process, the source to pay process, becoming more contracted and easier, because you've got one set of information going into your ERP, and then that being used everywhere else, rather than in lots of different places. And I know from working in a large multinational environment how complicated procurement tool landscapes can be. So to contract that and make that simplify that is a no-brainer.
So I totally agree with you. with the importance of digitalization. Would you say that companies who are going digital, who perhaps didn't before, or who are embracing digitalization, have a competitive advantage over those who are still finding suppliers the traditional way and perhaps haven't embraced digitalization?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I completely agree with that. I think there's a caveat, of course, that the early adopters are going to have the early problems, but companies that do that, if they've got good problem solvers on board who can work those problems through and come up with good solutions to that and take them forward, that's going to make them stronger. So there will be a few hiccups, and for sure, like any new technology, you're going to have some early failures and some burnt fingers, but that's far and away a much smaller part of the picture. The bigger picture, the stories you don't hear will be the ones that where it's really working, and it's working well, and people know what they're doing, and the company's accessing new markets, new competitive environments, and new supplier pools, especially in terms of things like the net zero transition that we need to do by 2050, 2030 in some cases. Big companies are going to need to find clean tech suppliers, and clean tech suppliers that need to start commercializing their products really quickly they're going to have a challenge, but they need to at first at least get that challenge, and that's through these networks. So and that's where I see a lot of growth in the next few years is companies trying to green their supply chain. And it doesn't just stop with the company, it's the supply network. The whole supply network needs to be carbon net zero. Otherwise your company isn't carbon net zero. So that's where I see the future. And so networks that can kind of bring those technologies to suppliers and to companies are going to play a big part in the future, I think.
Definitely. We're hearing more and more about green manufacturing, and this is a key factor that a lot of companies are now looking for when they do vet a supplier, is how green they are. So I think it is also key, definitely. What do you see are some of the roadblocks preventing procurement managers from being able to tap into the potential of existing and indeed new supplier relationships?
Okay. There's a number of things. I think, and this goes back to again the growth of sourcing and the evolution of sourcing. Used to be an accounts sort of an add-on to accounts, and seen mostly through the eyes of CFO as a cost saver. So you've got to deliver your 10% savings on these 5 suppliers this year. That's your objectives. That's and procurement are very good at that, and they're very comfortable at that. Give me that 10% savings target, and I will give you 12%. That's and that's great. That's fine. But I think the world is moving on a little bit, and as well as expecting, those targets to be exceeded, the company's going to start looking to procurement, because it has actually stepped up and met the challenge of COVID. It's going to from the C level suite, they're going to start saying, well, you clearly can add value as well as just lowering our costs. What can you give me to add value as opposed to just saving costs? I know that's just say just saving costs. Saving costs is not anything to be sniffed at. It's very important. But how can you start adding value as well as saving costs? And for me, that means it comes back to this supplier collaboration story. How we work with suppliers to expand markets, new technologies, NPI, new product introduction, and how can we how can we work with our suppliers to be somewhere different in 5 years' time? As I say, procurement specialists and procurement and sourcing managers, they're very good at hitting targets. They may be less good at seeing the bigger helicopter view, where we're going to be in 5 years' time. How can this supplier help me get there? So there needs to be a new skill set. And, I think, a lot of the procurement functions that I've seen over the last 3 or 4 years, they're starting to meet that challenge. But many are still, they're great at saving costs, but they don't see the bigger picture, and so they need the skills, those more strategic skills. The relationship building, as opposed to negotiating downwards. It's a different skill. It's not a million miles away, but it's a different skill. What can we both get out of this, as opposed to give me 10% on the unit price. So what can we both win from this, and being able to sell that vision to the supplier. You say that relationship, and then there's again problem solving, and that's come along with this digitization. There are problems to solve all the way through, not just within your own S2P process, but in terms of how you manage suppliers to get the best from them, and how you can encourage suppliers to let you take them on the journey with you, as opposed to saying, oh, we need to have a discussion about this product and your performance here and there. So it's a different way of looking at things, much more strategic. And I think at the moment, forward-thinking procurement functions are starting to get there, but it's overall, I think there's a lot of room for procurement to improve in that area.
I think they're very interesting points. I mean, we typically just think about what the supplier can offer us as a buyer, but actually, as you pointed out, it's key to see the holistic picture, and it's a two-way street, and it's all about collaboration. And I think that's really important, and a lot of us do oversee that. So I think that's really, really interesting. How important do you perceive having a stable supplier in terms of mitigating supply chain risk?
Yeah, I mean that's key. Again, you're betting the company on your suppliers. I've always said that managing suppliers is managing risk, because if they don't perform, you've got financial risk. If they're not being ethical in their business, if they're employing child labor, if they're using conflict minerals, if they're not paying their tax or fraudulent, that's a reputational risk, financial risk. You're risking your company on every supplier, not just your key strategic suppliers, but every supplier potentially is a risk to your business. And that's why sourcing the right suppliers and having strong processes to ensure that those suppliers not only meet all your requirements from the supplier, but continue to do so after you've signed the contract. For me, it comes down to having very good, strong, compliant processes and following the processes, and having the faith in your procurement team to deliver and manage those relationships. Just as the procurement team would have faith in their suppliers to supply on time, consistently, because that's what they've been engaged to do. So yes, absolutely important.
Yeah, you mentioned consistency. This is very important, not just going on board with the supplier, but that they're continuing to deliver what they suggested that they would at the outset. How about for those companies who are already paired with a specific supplier, however, they do feel that the relationship isn't as strong as it should be, or perhaps there's some misunderstanding? What do you think are some of the key aspects to kind of look out for which may improve relationships between the supplier and their customer?
Yeah, I think this is, again, going back to understanding what the wider objectives of your supplier are and whether they're in line with yours. Again, it depends on the supplier and how strategic they are to you. But if let's assume that they're strategic, one of the top 5 suppliers, you fundamentally betting the business on them. You need to you can't just sign on the dotted line and be done with that. That's you need to manage that relationship day in, day out to ensure that supplier is totally in tune with what you need them for. In many cases, you'll be in a tight position because there'll be maybe one of 2 or 3, a handful of suppliers you could possibly go with. So, and switching out suppliers is, expensive, and, the supplier will know that. So, the supplier will know, the strength of the relationship is from, perhaps on their side, especially if you're in a competitive market and other competitive companies are looking for the same goods and services from that supplier. So, you've got to manage that supplier really well. And when I say manage, I don't mean micromanage and on the phone every day, where's my order this, where is my order that? It's, it's about the relationship building, and I think this is quite interesting. It needs to be about the relationship building and the pervasiveness of your organization in with theirs. So there's often this culture of we have a one-touch policy. So you have one point of contact with us, and that's it. I think that's pretty dangerous because there's one single point of failure. And good collaboration and good supplier and buyer relationships. That relationship happens from procurement and the sales, one element, and then with production engineers and product managers at another level. So that it's a very complex area. It's not all about procurement, unfortunately. It's about that relationship throughout the business and how in tune throughout the business it is. And of course that implies that the procurement is in tune with its stakeholders internally. And there's a whole new can of worms there, because that's it's easy to say, oh yes, that's all fine, but in many cases you'll find procurement is the we try and avoid procurement because they've got all this red tape and they've got they need this and they need that, and they take so much time and they've got all the rules, and so procurement has a battle on, not a battle, but it has a conversation on both sides, within to its stakeholders and to its suppliers.
Definitely. So you highlighted there some really interesting points, one of which is that to just have one point of contact can be detrimental. And so how accessible on both sides the irrelevant teams are and how collaborative they are and easy to reach is crucial. And the ability to align strategic objectives of collaborators and understand their strengths and weaknesses is really important to assess the fit in line with the buyer's objective and obviously the supplier's skill set. So how can we touch a little bit on how procurement has developed or how it has become more innovative over the last few years and how you see this evolving in the future?
Yeah, so I've alluded to this a few times, but I think procurement has come on in leaps and bounds over the last 20, 30 years. It used to be just an accounting function, Then it became a cost function, and people started thinking about, segregating suppliers. I mean, that happened as recently as, I think it was 1983, when someone said, well, there are suppliers and there are suppliers. There are suppliers that are strategic. There are suppliers that are bottleneck, suppliers that are leverage. This is, procurement 101 these days. But, and that still applies. And none of this is kind of, we're not leaving behind something that that's always going to apply. Some suppliers are different from others. That's understood, and they all need to be treated in a slightly different way depending on their relationship and how much the supplier, you need that supplier. But it's going beyond that. It's beyond that, that, as I said before, that cost saving function, and it's and that will always be there, but there's more emphasis on, how can we make procurement work for us by adding value to our company? How can we, use the skills of procurement people to forge the best relationships we can with our suppliers, so that we become the customer of choice, that we, so that we get, we get our demands met before our competitors do, and and then it becomes a slightly different conversation you have with suppliers. It's, is it worth that 5% savings target to sully a relationship which could, potentially bring you much more than 5% a year? Is it, what about, as I've said before, what about new products? What about, your suppliers' ability to innovate and tapping into that? And suppliers who, and one of the reasons I'm not too keen on the idea of supply chains as opposed to supply networks is it assumes that your supplier is somehow smaller than you. And that's really not the case in most cases. Your supplier could be a huge company with lots of other things going on, with lots of innovative ideas, new production techniques, things that you can learn from your supplier. There's skill swaps. There's so much potential that a supplier can have for a company, that to have a conversation every year about 5-10% becomes irrelevant. It's how can we tap into the rich resources we have of our supply base? It's that really forward-thinking companies are going to start thinking more in those terms, and it's, for me, it's a discussion between your CPO, your CFO, and your CEO. Because if a CFO is just interested in savings, that's his job. That's fine. It's fair enough. The CEO needs to think about where the company's going in 5-10 years. What's the strategy? They should be, if they haven't got their eyes open to the possibilities that the supply base offers a company, then it's the CPO's job to open their eyes. If the CPO has got their eyes closed, the CEO, needs to pull them up. Somewhere in that group there needs to be the vision that the supply base can be used, in a much more innovative way, and and provide opportunity that's way beyond the savings. So that's where I see procurement going in the future.
I couldn't agree more. You've touched on some very, very relevant points there. And it is really still people's main focus is cost saving. But you're right, it goes so much deeper than that. And choosing the supplier wisely and thinking about the long term can obviously reap much greater rewards than, like you said, the 5% that you managed to save at the outset. So I think that's really, really interesting. We've covered a lot of points, and I think it'd be very, very useful for anybody who's thinking of finding new suppliers or unhappy with their existing suppliers, and your expertise there for them to reach out to you would be really beneficial. So we'll leave your details in the video at the bottom in the comments if anyone does want to reach out to you for your services. And thank you very much for your time. It's been very interesting, Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you very much.